All right, Arryn,
Hey.
welcome to Brisbane.
Yeah,
How are you going?
yeah, good. Nervous now. There's a camera.
Yeah, the camera on, people are taking photos. Although I like what you did with the camera, you know, I've never thought to like take photos of people while we're up here. So I might do that.
Before they disappear.
Yeah. So you're living in Berlin, yeah? How long have you been there?
On and off for about 10 years now.
Okay.
And so I never intended to move there. It was quite random, but life just sort of flows in that way. My mum was sick with cancer, and she was down in coughs, and I left teaching and stuff to look after her. And then after she passed away, I came back to Brisbane and felt like I had to get away in that sort of moment before you really properly start grieving. Kind of things were quite clear, and I got a residency in Rome and went to Rome first, and then friends of mine had a little apartment in Berlin, and they told me about the artist visa you could get. So I went to Berlin and I got this visa. It cost €30 for 3 years, so I thought, or 2 years, so I thought I'll travel Europe and see all the art not only seen in books.
Yeah.
And I did that, but I also found a studio and started painting. And then after about a year, I rolled up those canvases and brought them back and had a show with Heiser Gallery, which is closed down now. And that sold well enough for me to do it again.
Okay.
And now I've sort of accidentally done that like 7 or 8 times.
Accidentally.
And fell in love with an amazing woman, my partner, Monica. And and so now I'm following her.
Yeah, that's a great story. And you planning to stay a while?
I have no idea. My plan was to come back in 2020, and I'd lined up a museum touring show and a couple, like maybe 5 shows all up, and it all got completely slammed, and like the shows were cancelled, and I was locked out of the country for 2 years. Yeah, okay. And so I came back in 22 and did some of the shows, and Jan was very good, and in 2020, and showed me even though I couldn't come. I asked if I could have a show with her, and that's when we started working together. And so now something else happened in that period too. Other good things happened, like Monica started got an incredible project which funded fieldwork around the world to look at the reintroduction of critically endangered species that had gone extinct in the wild, but had been bred in zoos and breeding facilities, and then these projects of trying to reintroduce them to the wild. So we would go and interview the scientists and like stay with them a while and watch what they do, and so looking at the animals, but also the scientists just sort of working in the history of science now, I suppose. Yeah. So that also, yeah.
I mean, that's great, and I've got somewhere here where we'll talk about, how you kind of connect into that journey, because it does connect to the works that are in the stockroom, right?
Yeah.
But let's start with, I guess, what surround us and kind of ground it in, the philosophical element that we've had the opportunity to discuss. I think last week we did that. So the title of the show is Octopus Moon, and to complement it, I've titled this talk tonight, How Do We Know How to Be? And that actually came from you, right? So that reflection came out of our pre-talk when you expressed to me that your work since college involves quite a bit of abstraction, and which for you extends out of phenomenology and existentialism, which are 2 very rich schools of philosophy. So when we think of existentialists, you might think Sartre, Camus, Beauvoir, and Beckett. And phenomenologists, you might think Husserl, Heidegger, and Merleau-Ponty. So what existentialists have in common with each other is the view that existence precedes essence. Sounds fancy, but in essence, what it means is that there's no template for being in the world. One just finds that one exists, and you have to just take it from there. Phenomenology, which shares a lot with existentialism, is grounded in the concept of phenomenon in Greek, meaning that which appears. It is concerned with the experience of the subject, in the world over any grand overarching theory or reality. So I'd love to hear how abstraction in your work enlivens these two philosophical traditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I liked when I was at uni, I liked the phenomenologist. It was more of a process thing, right? Like this idea of not starting with a theory or trying to come up with a structure to think through, but you start directly with what you can see or what you can feel, and that sense of working with the process, and like you play with things and they fall apart, and so you can only do something with clay and not other things, for example. And so the structure comes out of, the rules come out of the materials itself, you know, or the things that you do with them. And it's not like concept, process, resolution.
Sure.
Which is how all our feedback forms at art school were. And no artist actually thinks like that. I don't know. But rather I find that now I really feel that it's just process, and that the outcomes or the resolutions are kind of just the things that happen on the way, and the concepts can be right at the end. You know, it's the thoughts or the realizations that you have along the way as well, and it's just another part of the process. And yeah, the sort of more fluid ways, which I think there was a bit of that in existentialism and phenomenology that I'm attracted to. And I think the way I think about abstraction is really through that method of process. It's not like cubism or there's not a theory of abstraction. It's just really more of like playing with something and seeing what it does. Like, I mean, these paintings are just with black on a cream ground, you know, and they're working through limitation in a way, you know. I've stripped away the other colour and those kinds of things. So if I'm trying to paint a spider web, I mean, it's a bit silly to try and paint a spider web with black marks and then fill in the area around it black as well. You know, in a way it'd be easier to paint white on black, you know, because the web is white. But then you have these funny results, like these little things that, I don't know, it's a little bit like dew in the web or something. You don't really, yeah. Wait a minute. I was trying to look for an example in what I was looking at to say about something about how abstraction relates to these philosophies. That it's comes close to, you know, you're working with intuition a lot, but you're also working with the structures that are given to you by the things that you're doing.
Yeah,
so,
sure.
So a weird, yeah.
So would it be fair to say it's like a feedback loop?
Absolutely.
You're working, and then something happens, and you keep working, and eventually something emerges.
And like, in a funny way, like complexity always seems to build up in that process, right? So I'm always stripping away things because each time you do something different, it spins off into other possibilities, and I find that quite exciting too. You know, like, because sometimes you think you strip away and you've got very little to play with, and then you know, like the watercolors in there started as color studies with just a 2x4 grid, and it was just those shapes were just a bit too big on the paper for the color. I thought I can divide them up more. And as soon as I started that, then it ends into this kind of almost infinite possibilities of pattern, especially when that's combined with the possibilities of colour.
Yeah, sure.
So the game just became bigger and bigger in a way.
Yeah. And so abstraction then would seem in contrast to like a realism, right? So you're not starting with a real image in mind that you then render.
Yeah.
Because I mean, you can still see figures, right? You've got the octopus.
Here, this is a thing we're talking about abstraction, but like animals and spider webs, you know, these are real things. So it is a bit of a step in a way. Like, this is something different that I'm coming to terms with. I mean, like Bato, this little foal over here. He does have a presence, and he's looking back out at you, and that's quite different to a spider web or an abstract painting. You know, it's like a portrait. There's a presence of someone there on the other side somehow. And so this is something that I'm not sure about yet. I don't know how to talk about that yet.
That's good. That's good. I like that there's, you know, a challenge in it, right?
And of course I had to, you know, get the proportions right and all of those kinds of things, right? So it was a different moment when, and in a way it came because, well, I was painting the text paintings, and I thought they were going to be text paintings that went with some other abstract paintings I didn't end up bringing. And to bring curves back into my patterns, because I've been working with triangles for a long time. And the curves turned into hills and highways quite easily. And then once there was landscapes, there needed to be animals in the landscapes. And so, I don't know, like each painting kind of came after the one before in a way that was quite unexpected.
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, maybe we can settle on, I've made a note here, abstraction as a feedback loop process that admits figures from time to time.
Yeah, that's great.
I don't know what it is, but, you know, that's what I'm getting.
Yeah.
So you were speaking with Jeff before, and I was eavesdropping, and you were talking a bit about Colin Pecan and your, I guess, interaction with his work, and I believe you did your dissertation on that as well. I'd love to hear more. Well, I heard a little bit, but I think others, you know, would benefit from hearing more about that.
Colin Pecan is a New Zealand painter, and who is probably the most famous New Zealand modernist and an incredible artist. And he worked with text. And he, my thesis was on the last 4 paintings he did, which were just white text painted over black, and there were quotations from Ecclesiastes in the Bible, and it was all things like, but it was all of the most brutal parts with none of the hope. So it was, I count the dead happy because they're dead, you know, better off to have never been born kind of stuff, right? And it's sort of like how there's no justice in this world, and there's no justice, there's no afterlife, there's nothing, right? It's all just, it's quite a nihilistic text. And yet, they're painted in this white that sort of, every time he dips the brush, it's this denser white, and it fades away as he writes the letters in this hand script. So they sparkle like stars, and there's this kind of rhythm, this flowing rhythm across there, and they're beautiful, and they're on quite a matte black, on unstretched canvas, sort of pinned. You just see them pinned to the wall when you see them. And I saw one of these paintings that hung with a big famous I Am in Canberra, and I saw a second one that was on in a touring show. And they just really hit me in the gut. I thought these were very powerful paintings, and he's getting at something quite strong here, and it's not this despair. If you wrote that on a scrap of paper and then you died and left that on your studio floor, that would be one thing. But the fact that he's painted them, the physicality and the materiality of the paint, and this white glowing out of the darkness, it reminded me quite strongly of Samuel Beckett's plays, which we know, you know, like they are also very nihilistic in their content, but they're not in their form somehow. Somehow there's still this movement, this action, this doing something in the face of the void, even if it is speaking the very truth of this, you know, this nihilistic thought kind of void. So Beckett was really important to me in these years, in my 20s, I suppose, when I was developing like my foundation of thought and stuff. And so Colin Pecan is I'm working in black and white now. Whenever I'm painting text work, I mean, that's my reference. I'm not painting white on black. I'm letting the white come from underneath. But also that sense of movement and rhythm that I find also, funnily enough, in Paul Klee in Germany, which I had no real connection with here. Like, I'd seen him learn about Paul Klee in art history and stuff. Only seeing like multiple shows of his, you realise how radically playful he is in every moment, and always leaving it open and changing and shifting. And anyway,
that's great. That's great. Thanks for sharing that.
Well,
go. No, you.
I could say, like, we're talking about like the way, like with this phenomenology, existentialism, Beckett, Colin Pecan, the way I was thinking maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I've continued, reading and things like that, and especially returning to anthropology and anthropological philosophers, and finding in that writing a new answer, in a way, or something that was missing for me in existentialism. And it was almost like a blind spot, and I think it's a blind spot a bit in Beckett and stuff. Maybe we talked a little bit about this on the phone, which is that in that 20th century philosophy, the sense of identity that is looking out, we say we're experiencing being, or like we're in the world and then experiences first. There's a strong sense that still that identity is fixed somewhere, that the fixed point is like behind your eyes somewhere, and it's like, yes, you're dealing with an absurd world, but there's in this, think of like Tim Ingold or Isabel Stengers, there's this quote from her which is that being is always becoming, and becoming is always becoming with. And so this sense of collaboration, or this sense of movement and change, and that we ourselves are, a collaboration of billions of bacteria and all kinds of things, and that we're always in collaboration with the world around us. So there isn't, so it's this more fluid sense of being that I don't, that I'm looking for.
Yeah, sure. And what I trace there, right, given the beginnings of your time at college and your thesis, and is this strong influence from existentialism and phenomenology, but then starting to scratch away at perhaps philosophy that is looking at something in a different way. I made some notes when we talked last time of this notion of the individual's identity being rendered fixed or even rational, which from what I understand is going somewhat against the tenet of existence preceding essence, right? So even though existentialism may not speak of an essence of the human, it might still then speak about the essence of Arryn or Elaine, and it seems like you're trying to push even beyond that, like the essence of oneself as fixed through time and going through the world. Yeah,
I mean, I still have that. Like I still feel like I'm the 7-year-old looking out, through my eyes and what I've seen, and the experience and knowledge is one thing, but so maybe I'm trying to undo it in myself a little bit,
Well, how do you find this notion of the fixed individual potentially limiting to creating art, or even to appreciating art? If we're trying to overcome it.
Maybe I can try and answer it by talking about what a painting is.
Okay.
Maybe, I don't know if this is going to work, we'll try anyway. I'm sort of thinking, looking at this painting right here, because it's in front of me, but just a mixture of text and pattern, or any painting really, the sort of thing is, painting is either a window or a mirror in some ways, right? Is it a witnessing of the world, or a kind of self-expression, or whatever it is. It's funny that painting is this, I like to think of them as like a vessel, like a bowl for meaning, or a bowl which fills up with stuff. And you can tip it out upside down and it empties out, right? And often with abstract painting, you'll turn upside down and it looks entirely different. I mean, it's a bit hard to turn these upside down because of the words. Turn that upside down.
Yeah.
And so it is, again, like this kind of location of different things, and this one is like text and pattern and how they flow and interact, and there's what I've put there and there's what the viewer brings to it. So that, and sometimes they can feel empty and sometimes they can feel full. And I think the longer paintings have been around, in many ways, the more they kind of fill up, the longer they've been on. I was painting these sheet paintings, which were big square, white squares blown out of shape. and the kind of thin transparent layers, and I do like 4 or 5 of each, like of a sheet blowing in a slightly different direction. So they're kind of like a flip book of a sheet of the clothesline blowing, but in one image. And when I painted them, I was thinking about like the white square of modernism and this existential stuff, but it was pretty dry in a way, right? Mm-hmm. And then I hung the exhibition, and my grandmother had a stroke, and I flew to Sydney, and I was by her bed, and she passed away, and I flew back to Brisbane with my mum, and we went straight from the airport to the opening of the show. And so it was really kind of, we got there at like 6:30 or something, and I walked in, I'm not expecting it, and it was just, well, they were just full of grief, right? Like, and there's no way that that's not there in the work. You know, there wasn't there when I made the work. And the amount of people that have come to me, up to me about those paintings and talked about loss with them. I mean, they are white sheets, so they did have that veil thing, but like, it wasn't the plan.
Sure,
and
sure.
like, and I'm curious about that, like how those things fill up. And I think the more I do work with like a structured plan, like this is going to do this, the more it doesn't work, or I get sidetracked and ends up as something else.
Yeah, sure. What I hear in that, and it's wonderful, right? It's like this, not only breaking away from identity as such, but breaking away from the notion of the conscious self. You know, the person that does the thinking and the planning and or the cognitive self, the thinking, the planning, the execution, and then in you know, the story that you just tell, you come back to it and see something that you hadn't even intended, but it was still you. Yeah. So yeah, there's something in there for me around identity and that connection to cognitive being or self, which tends to try to hold oneself fixed through time. You know, others might call it the ego, whatever. Yeah. But yeah, it perhaps is less fixed or stable than we might like to think, right? Yeah. So some of the anthropological philosophers, would you include in those like Tim Ingold, Bruno Latour, Donna Haraway? Yeah. And you mentioned Isabel Stengers already. It probably wouldn't be an in conversation if I didn't drop a little Deleuze in there. This attempt to overcome what you call this existentialist identity thing. Certainly, well, Deleuze certainly attributes that in his philosophy, right? And it's a philosophy of becoming where difference or flux is ultimately what's at the base of all being, right? And yeah, it's interesting. So that quote that you mentioned before, being is always becoming and becoming is always becoming with, you know, goes all the way back to what the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus said. I really like this quote: "No one ever steps into the same river twice, and if it's not the same river, it's not the same person." So both those quotes really draw out impermanence or becoming, but also the importance of relationality, right? So in Stengers' quote, it's more direct: becoming is always becoming with. But in Heraclitus' quote, it's still there. It's not the same river, and therefore not the same person. So the person and the river kind of have this interrelational sense of being, and as one thing changes, the other thing changes with it. How do these ideas of becoming, change, flux, difference, impermanence influence your work now?
Yes, it's a funny thing, you know, because I'm making paintings, like, and in terms of like what we talk about, like, you know, at art school and stuff, like, of all the art forms, paintings are pretty autonomous. You know, like they
feel pretty fixed.
Fixed boundary, you know, and often a lot of contemporary art for a long time was trying to undo that in painting, and do that it's about painting and stuff. So it's a funny, go backwards and forwards on these things. Like, so that cognitive me, that ego or whatever, is still there trying to understand and do these things, or just to let space for the process to happen, if that makes sense. And that's part of the biggest challenge in a way in the studio, is to, it just requires a time of working, and in a way often butting your head against yourself a long time before you just kind of let it happen as it happens. And I found doing collaborations have helped a lot. I was collaborating with Monica, but also with Nathan Shepherdson, who's a poet, with friends who are dancers, musicians, and sometimes. And one of the big advantages about this time in Berlin is that it's a lot cheaper for me to live there, and I have a beautiful studio, and maybe only about 20% of the time spent being working as an artist is working towards something that will be exhibited. Most of it has been play, and very serious play, but also very, so I've done a lot of chalk drawing work. That really helped. And at first that was just so that I could draw large and quickly. And I mean, first thing I did when I got the studio was drag a massive piece of thick wood off the side of the street that I found and paint it black, and just do a lot of drawing on it. When I knew I wouldn't be carting home paper or this kind of stuff. So.
And that's quite impermanent, right? So you're drawing and
like doing
erase.
The drawing, and I would snap a photo of it and erase it, and then do another, and like just do thousands of these drawings.
Wow.
And that and I've tried to turn that into work. I have done big chalk works, which then change throughout the show, and that's a nice process too. It's funny, I keep coming back to painting, and it's a weird thing, right? Like whether playing with video or photography or drawing or other kinds of things, there's something about, I just know I'm a painter because if it's on canvas, then it counts, it matters. Okay. And I love doing these watercolors that are in the other room, but they're on paper, right? So there is something, they're a bit easier for me to do because they don't quite count. I mean, I probably shouldn't be saying
that's art school, right?
They do. I love them. They're beautiful works, but it's like it's the even if I paint on board, doesn't quite and I don't know whether it's something that, if it's because of just art history drummed in.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Is this to what extent is this cultural?
Because I've been around, I mean. Been around contemporary art my whole art life.
Yeah.
Right? I don't see this in other people's work. I don't go, if it's not painting, it's just only, it's kind of a funny thing. Maybe I think it's partly because I can see any time I'm having myself on, any time I'm decorating a painting, and you can see it in the painting, right? Anything that's not necessary in there, or if I'm off, it just doesn't work. And so it's trying to hit that thing, that little magic thing that makes it more than itself, more than some marks on paper or marks on canvas, right? It's that moment where this thing arrives, and it feels like I didn't paint it. It feels like it came from outer space,
So I'm trying to kind of place this notion of flux into or with the painting, right? So you're there and you're making marks and something emerges. So that process is really quite transitory, and it terminates with the painting. But then there's the entire durability of that painting and the way that people interact with it. And it's kind of interesting and weird at the same time that this entire transitory set of processes, right? The process of making and the process of viewing should find its nexus at something that's seemingly so static. That's just an observation, but
I was curious, isn't
I
it?
don't really have any thoughts on it.
So is it like going, oh look, the whole universe is in flux, right?
Yeah,
Like,
except for
I'm
this
a
painting.
I'm going to fix it up
Yeah,
to the wall.
yeah. So, yeah.
Paul Clay has some great pedagogical stuff that he wrote when he was teaching at the Bauhaus, and he talks about leaving a painting open, always like unfinished or incomplete or like in a moment of change.
Yeah.
You know? And I think that I like that. I try for that movement in my paintings where it is, or like you know, like this. You could see I could just as easy, you know, paint in another one of these, right? Like it's kind of, there is enough, but only just. And I think that's. I really like to be able, you know, to stop, to not do that. Oh, just one more, just finish it up over here.
Yeah, sure.
Because whenever I do that, then I've lost this. I've lost something. That fresh. There's a vibration that you just kind of lose, and like, it's a tough challenge. And like, there's plenty, you know. And then you have to go so far with the painting again before that moment appears, where it's
right. There's like
there's this vibration of attention of it being complete and not complete.
And I think with your process, that's even more the case, right? Because you're paring back this white that's underneath, and you can go too far and you can't reverse that.
Yeah, these have been a challenge like that. Like, there's a point where, you know, you start by painting black marks on white. Excuse me, but it gets to a point where then you're just erasing white with the black, and at that switch, it's a moment they kind of become nocturnal. These paintings, I think. And are quite, it's nice to be on that boundary, or then if you go way further, like the octopus, you know, or the foal over there, where it's really sunk into the night, and by then I've cut out everything that's not just necessary. I don't think I could really cut more out of those paintings. You know, like you black it out.
You painted them at night, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, so I've been working on paper with this process for a number of years, and only did a few canvases, and that process with the paper, because I make big grids of these texts and patterns, which many of you have seen, and then wanting to come onto canvas with that, but I would usually do those at night. And whether it be because I'd be painting something else in the day, or sometimes having friends over, you know, you have a glass of wine and a joint, and like you're just painting and listening to music, and it was quite a free and fresh way, and also they're black and white. I don't need strong light. It can happen with the lamp light. So when I'm painting with colour, it sort of has to be in the daytime. That's partly it. But then when I started, you know, getting into this body of work, working on canvas, I, you know, would turn up in the day and then just sort of sit and look at the canvas, ready to start. And I think
it wouldn't work.
It just wouldn't work. I just couldn't. Okay. And like, so I didn't work with pencil on the canvases beforehand. Yeah. A couple of times I'd measure something like the moons in there, or like, see, these are on a grid, these ones. I would measure down the side and put a little dot. But then even that was just with a black paint. But yeah, and then like, so you just have to, you know, go. And like once the first marker's on, then you got a problem. And then you just, you know, painting till it's done.
That's great. Let's talk a little bit about the paintings that are not in view, the smaller works, and your relationship with Monica. So I understand. Are you leaving?
I'll grab one.
Bye. Yeah. Just you know, so we're not talking about something that's out. Yeah, sure. So you were accompanying Monica doing her field work, right? Yeah. Is it anthropology?
Yeah, well, she was an anthropologist, and but this project has been in history of science. So now she's completing a second PhD with this project as well. So, yeah, but she works as an anthropologist, I suppose. She, like a lot of field work, like this direct experience.
Yeah.
As well as Anyway.
So how do these relate?
All right, so these actually started before this field work.
Okay.
And they started out of Nathan Shepherdson's poems. So it's going to get complex and messy.
That's all right. That's great.
Where so they started in the pandemic,
yes.
and I didn't have access to my studio for a while.
Okay.
And so I was stuck at home, and it was towards the end of working out of Nathan's poems, which was about a 5-year project. And in those poems, which are cut-ups of Grant's Guide to Fishers, this incredible book, this fishing guide, the poems are cut-up poems, and I cut up the poems to make the paintings, and then sort of replace the words with colour somehow, but I kept finding these symmetries in the poems that I started to call Jefferson physics, this sort of very absurd set of, yet somehow internally consistent set of rules or relationships. So you find one line in a poem that proves something else in another poem,
Okay.
And I don't know how much it was me projecting these or how much it was Nathan's brilliance, but I started how do I say, I ended up, the big paintings from that project are these big net paintings, which are kind of atmospheric colour and using just thin painted lines to kind of frame that in like nets across this colour. And so working at home, I just working with these, I didn't have access to the studio to be doing this, I was just trying layering colours on top of each other and like next to each other and seeing what I could do. So they just started as colour studies on a maybe this one's easier to see, on like a 2x4 grid, and then at some point I got a compass off my flatmate and added circles or just started breaking it up in different ways, and the patterns, because of the symmetries, maybe they sort of start to look esoteric, but there was never any, they're quite arbitrary, and arbitrary even to the colour. So I'd draw them in the evening and then do the watercolours in the morning, and it became this way of surviving the pandemic, and I worked on them a lot. And then when we could travel again, it was the pads are this size, and so I could just take my pads and my watercolours with me, and then if I was staying in a hotel or an Airbnb or in a yurt out in the Mongolian desert, I could just do them. So it went from working with Nathan and these things about the reef to then just trying to take that process out with me, and so just recording little moments of colour. And it might be that there's just one colour I'm after, and trying to find or the atmosphere that's between a colour, and they might not actually, and maybe end up needing to put a blue even though there's no blue in what you're after, finding it with the oppositions and stuff. So again, the process of abstraction. So it's funny, I try and limit myself to something. In a way, most of my work has been black and white over the 20 years of painting or whatever. But it's not, I love colour, it just feels like if there's colour, it's just everything. The whole work is about that colour, right? Here it's all black and white except for one little red square, and but I don't know.
Okay, so but you took some of these with you on the trip. So it's like you were taking some of your studio with you, and then it looks like you brought some of what was in the field back to the studio. Yeah.
So I was sketching, like I was saying before, a lot of what I do doesn't actually make it to be exhibited. I've done it. I started drawing the animals at some point, and Morty wanted some drawings for a presentation or paper that she was doing with a friend. And so I'm like, well, and so we were there, the chance to sketch and, and so that's from a little watercolour that I did in the field, and then like it's some sketches, and it's can I tell a story? Does anyone?
Do the bit about the food.
Jan wants to hear it again.
So this is a Przewalski's horse, or Tucky, which is the last species of wild horse that was never domesticated, except for the zebra, but zebra is pretty separate from other horses. Right? So this horse was once all over Eurasia, and it's a stubby little pony, very proud looking, with a short mane like a Greek sculpture, and it's got, as an adult, it's got a black stripe down its spine, and white socks, and it's kind of a tan colour. And it went extinct in the wild in the 20th century, and the ones alive today come from 12 in the 1920s. So there was a few more, but like all the ones alive today come from these 12 that were in zoos, and some breeders had them and stuff. And then they were, bred and transported around the world in different zoos and things. And then in the 90s, they tried to start to reintroduce them into Mongolia. And the project, failed for 10, 15 years, and eventually often these projects do, right? It's quite a famous one because it's such a large animal, and it's in one of the harshest places on Earth, in the middle of the Gobi Desert. And so when the pandemic ended, or like as soon as we could travel, we went to Mongolia and went out there, and like it's the furthest I've ever been from home. And so we're living in yurts with 2 scientists and 12 rangers. They have a little enclosed area and one sort of brick building for the science. And it was foaling season, it was spring, and so they were going out every day. We'd go out with them, and driving a couple of 100 kilometres across the desert, like looking for like dust on the horizon, and then trying to use the car like a panther to sneak up behind hills and get as close as we could, and then they would count the foals. And the 2 scientists were the only people who they knew the horses by name when they're like this big in binoculars. Incredible. But the rangers, who are all local herdsmen, they didn't even know that. But the thing, and so Gumba would say, that's Azar out there. This is a retired stallion who's just sort of hanging out by himself. And Monik would know Azar's whole lineage, right? And so, he was the son of this. They came from Prague Zoo, and it came from.
Oh, wow.
And so we got on. As soon as Gumba realised how, dedicated Moni was to the whole thing. And so anyway, we were out one day and he got a phone call from some local, there's some traditional, it's a restricted area except for some traditional herding families who like what you imagine, they have goats, and they've got a couple of motorcycles and like a Soviet truck, but otherwise, they're fully nomadic. They move 4 times a year, and they'd found an abandoned foal, or like a foal that had lost its mum. And so the next day we drove out there with Gumba, the director, and he was like, look, it's probably, don't get your hopes up, it's probably going to die, that's generally what happens if they're, it's pretty. We went there, and I was taking some photos of him. Arrived in this little valley with these mountain ranges, a bit green. There was a spring, so there's this little bit of grass around, and they had a herd of horse. You could see the goats up on the hill, and a few yurts. And we sort of went up the valley more, and they'd put the foal Butter, they called him, which is his child in Romanian, in Mongolian, with 2 cows who were looking after him. You can't put him with the horses will kill him.
Okay.
But yeah, I was taking some photos, and he just came up very trusting, like making a clicking noise, it's a very nice moment to meet this guy whose existence is so fragile, right? Not only lost in the Gobi Desert, not only 12, from 12 ancestors not so long ago, and so Yeah, we went in, so they invited us in to have lunch and like to discuss, because Gumball was going to give them some money to look after them for a few more days until they could take it to the enclosure, or a couple of weeks until they could move in. And the wife had been feeding him a secret recipe, which was something like goat's milk and sugar and water every 4 hours. So he was in a good place with them. And so we sit down. It's very minimal inside a yurt. You have 2 beds, like a cupboard, and a little cooking area. And so the guests sit on the women's bed, and then the men sit there, and then the women look after the food. And so sit down, and then you're handed entree, which is like a big plastic bucket of boiled guts, all still connected, you know, like just the washed and clean and and then a big Bowie knife. And the idea is you just got to cut off a bit of everything, you know, and like.
Is it cooked, or are you cooking it yourself?
It's just boiled.
No, I just thought maybe you were cooking it like a Korean barbecue style.
It's pretty full on, and you know, but like, so I would stay with a bit. I can eat guts. I'm okay with guts. Like Morty was, and then lunch is like goat's fat and rice soup, which is very nice actually, but very strong. And so they worked out how to, you know, some pay and whatever. And then after we left, he was taken to the enclosure and put with a couple of adolescents who'd come from Prague, I think. Prague Zoo has a lot to do with this reintroduction program. Some of the mares that were, some mares came from Australia in the initial release, or no, in around, and they came in exchange for a vote, for Mongolia's vote for the Sydney Olympics. Believe it or not. So,
you can't say that on camera.
And the Sydney Olympics got over the line by one vote too.
Because of this.
This little guy. Well, we don't know. It could be one of his moms. But yeah. Anyway. So I just think once I'd painted the octopus, which came out of painting the stars, and the stars looking like suckers in that painting, and that painting, it sort of was like, oh no, there's an octopus, and then I tried to avoid it a little bit, and then I just sort of did it.
It was just there.
And then once there was one animal, I thought, well, the next one has to be this.
Okay.
So it's just, I think that's the way I'm going to approach it. If I paint more animals, might be just animals I've met.
Okay.
Just like, yeah.
Yeah, and there were some words, and I think we'll end on this, that have come up in our pre-talk and also tonight. The word spirituality didn't come up tonight, but we did touch on it. And I think, there's something of the spiritual that you're kind of alluding to there, like your connection to this particular animal. So spirituality, fragments, and complexity. Just those 3 words. Please respond.
Yeah, it's really good 3 words. Cause of course, I think I have trouble with the word spirituality because it's the best word, and it's what everything that I'm doing is about, right? Like my work is a spiritual practice. But I don't trust it because I don't trust words, and I don't trust ideology. And as soon as I say spiritual, we're thinking about Jesus and God knows what else, and that anything might be any set of words might be a trap, and that so it's good to shift and change them. And in that way, fragments are an incredible way to work. And this show is incredibly fragmentary, right? Like there are fragments pointing in quite different directions. And yet somehow what happens is that the space fills up between the fragments, I think, and that with that unspoken thing, as long as those fragments are somehow, what was the third word?
Complexity.
As long as those fragments are somehow, have some truth in them, right? Or speak to that complexity,
I love that. All right, well, Arryn, thank you.
Thanks, mate.
That was great.
Oh, yeah, question.
Yeah, but I still was thinking. I'd like to open up to the audience. Maybe, Nathan.
Hi, Arryn, Nathan.
Hey, Nathan.
Yeah, that's fascinating like I've talked to you a lot, obviously, over the years, and but I always learn something every time I hear you talk. And Lan's idea of complexity is interesting because you do actually talk a lot about and think a lot about maths and physics. You want to touch on that? And I'm just listening and wondering, like probably, other people start with something simple and just end up with a tangled ball, but maybe do you actually start with a tangled ball and try and, sort of not necessarily untangle it, but just sort of get something out of it, maybe a different angle. And I'm wondering whether moving back to the so-called black and white, is there a physics element to that? Because it's almost like painting with dark matter, because you're saying about the webs that you're not, like you're going the other way rather than you're adding the black line to the white surface. So I'm just wondering, is that sort of a fairly naive idea, I suppose? But if you could speak a little bit about the maths and the physics, how that comes into it.
Well, the black, it's nice working with this matte black. I worked on it I make the black myself. It's iron oxide pigment and egg and linseed oil and a little bit of resin, and just getting that as matte as possible so that it kind of just soaks up the light and that the white can jump out. It's not as black as possible. Iron oxide is not that black, but means you can still sort of feel it, see the brush marks and stuff in it a little bit. As for the math of that, then I'm not sure. Like,
didn't you have a story about the spiders can count to?
Oh yeah. Well, there we go. Yeah, I'll tell you.
Outside the web at 9, inside the web or something.
I was reading a lot of spider studies. There's a whole lot of things going on about animal intelligence at the moment. There's a bit of a renaissance about like scientific studies of animal intelligence, and there's one on the golden orb spider, which is that it can count to 3 when it's not in its web, like 1 too many, right? But if it's inside its web, it can count to like 8 or 9. And so there's a thing like we think of like spiders are making webs to catch flies, but they're also like tightening the web or loosening the web depending on the wind and the rain and the weather. Once they're inside the web, they're much more expanded into their environment. They're feeling all of these complex things. They're also thinking, like able to do more maths, right?
Yeah. I'm wondering if I don't know, I'm entirely speculating, but in the web, each leg might have a sensation depending on what's going on in the web.
Yeah.
So they're like leg 4, leg 7. But in the, off the web, they're looking with their eyes, 1 too many.
Yeah, 1 too many. Yeah. And the way they measure those distances is a leg's width, right? So they measure all the distances with their legs somehow.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, octopus, their legs can think independently and taste because they've all got their suckers, and see because they've got light-sensitive skin as well. And so all independent from the main brain.
Yeah.
Right?
Talk about relationality.
They're colourblind.
They're colourblind, even though they can merge into their backgrounds, they're colourblind.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's crazy.
Very cool.
The 8 and the 8 as well. The spiders and
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. You probably did that just come to you? Or?
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Just why are there no spiders in the web?
Because I was trying it, it was because I was sympathising with these poor spiders in another study, which was this one that NASA did a study on spiders in the 90s, where they gave them different drugs and they saw to see how different the webs came out. And in the 90s there was a postcard around that was like a don't take drugs postcard, which had the spider webs, right? But they'd affected the images, they'd blown them out. And when you see the actual photos, the one on LSD is a super nice web. Really perfect. And the worst web is caffeine.
Ah.
So, yeah, really. But
that one's legal.
But that one's legal.